Ladies and gentlemen, this is Pat Anderson, and he's the pilot of this Catalina PBY. Pat, the first word that comes to mind about this airplane is it's big.
It's very big. The wingspan on it, Fred, is 104 feet. The empty weight of the aircraft is 19,000 pounds. It grosses out just a little over 30,000 pounds. It has a 1,750-gallon fuel capacity, which gives it a range of about 24 hours endurance.
It could fly for 24 hours?
Yes, I've talked to quite a few PBY pilots this weekend here at Gillespie, and they have said that they've been up over 20 hours on combat missions with the aircraft.
Now, its primary function was submarine patrol?
It had a few functions. There's a squadron in the South Pacific called the Black Cats, and they would go out looking for convoys to attack at night. The aircraft were painted black, and it was also called, the aircraft was nicknamed the Dumbo, and it would pick up downed airmen in the sea, and also it would go out and do patrol for submarine and shipping convoys.
I seem to remember that Black Cat patrol. I knew an enlisted Navy man. They used enlisted men as pilots sometimes.
That is correct, they did.
I thought that's what it was, and he told me that he had several kills, that they were painted black and that they let enlisted men fly. Tell us about the engines on this airplane.
The engines are two Pratt & Whitney 1830s, produce 1,200 horsepower apiece, and some of the aircraft after the war were retrofitted with B-25 engines, which were R2600s that would up the horsepower to 1,700 horsepower per side.
What was the reason for doing that?
Well, the aircraft it's very slow. It has a cruise speed of about 95 to 100, and it would get up on the step while it was taking off from sea much quicker if it had the bigger engines installed on them. This was a modification that was done, and it was done on very few aircraft.
95 to 100 is about what a Ford Trimotor did.
Yeah, or a Cessna 150. Yeah. But with the endurance that it had and the massive 104-foot wing on it, it was a slow aircraft.
Yeah. What was the crew?
Well, the crew complement on it was anywhere from, I've seen as many as seven men on the aircraft.
I would guess you could fly it with 3.
Yeah, we have a minimum crew right now, as Confederate Air Force flies it, of 3, pilot, co-pilot, and a flight engineer on the aircraft at this time. They had a radio operator, a navigator, pilot, co-pilot, waist gunner, and a flight engineer on the aircraft.
They had one waist gunner or 2 waist gunners?
One waist gunner would operate both blisters in the rear of the aircraft, or operate 2 machine guns from the left and right side.
So when they went out on the Tomcat or the Black Cat patrol, were they dropping bombs?
Sure, they would carry 2 Mark 8 torpedoes or a couple of 500-pound bombs that they would use, and also the aircraft had 250 calibers, and also it had about 3 30 caliber machine guns mounted throughout the aircraft.
The torpedoes were deadly then?
Yes, yeah, they would go and attack shipping and convoys, and they're credited with a lot of destruction with the Japanese fleet.
And flying at around 90 to 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, I have some footage on it that's really spectacular what the aircraft can do.
Well, we've talked about the engines and about the crew. Let's talk a little more about the wing. It has a particular shape. Can you tell us about that?
Well, if you're familiar with the J3 Cub, it's designed pretty close to the same kind of wing as that. It's a high-lift wing. As I said before, it's 104 feet wingspan with the floats up on it.
It's almost a parasol wing.
Yeah, it's a very high-lift wing, and it's almost like a club, and that's one of the reasons the aircraft is so slow. It does. You actually have to eat your Wheaties before you go fly it in the morning.
Well, you're using your horsepower, you're using your energy for lift rather than for speed.
That's correct. It is a very heavy aircraft to fly. It's one of the most demanding aircraft to fly that I've ever flown, and it's very slow, and it's a two-handed, 2-man operation.
In the movie they had about I don't remember if it was the Thresher, the ship that took the atomic bomb to Tinian. Wasn't a PBY the one that spotted them and the guy threw out all the cargo and then had them up on their wings? Do you remember that scene?
No, I don't remember that one.
The PBY was flying patrol, and the pilot went back and he was sitting in a rocking chair looking out the window. And he looked down, he saw all these men in the water. And he immediately threw out everything they had in there, all of the cargo, the Admiral's toilet paper, the Admiral's rocking chair, everything that was in there, he threw it out the door for these people to hold on to. And then they landed, and the next scene showed the wings and the fuselage and the entire airplane covered with seamen that they had drug out of the ocean and put up there to dry out. What are some of the other functions of the airplane?
This particular aircraft at one point in time was a water bomber up in Canada.
It would be good for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was installed with a hopper in the center of the aircraft, and they would drop down onto a lake and keep the aircraft on the step.
And scoop it up on the fly.
Scoop up the water, and then they'd go dump it on the fire. And one interesting scene, if you've seen the movie Always, the opening scene is a PBY on the water, and it was used quite extensively for that, and there's still quite a few around. About 22 PBYs still flying, to the best of my knowledge.
Can you tell us when the airplane first flew?
It was built in 1945. It was just after the war ended, and I believe it was December of 45. Here we have the interior of the PBY Catalina. Just basic instruments on the aircraft consist of the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, an artificial horizon, rate of climb indicator. Here we have our engine instruments across here, and then our radios for communication. And it's basically just a repeater for the captain's side over there. And then the audio panels and the engine controls. And on this aircraft, it's a little bit different. Up here we have our throttles, or our power levers, which are located in the ceiling for controlling our power to the engine, and also the propeller pitch control levers. Back on the aft panel of the PBY, we have the switches basically here for the landing lights and position lights, battery switch, electrical panel for the generator controls and reset switches, some circuit breakers located down here, and up here is our mixture control levers to the engine for fuel control, and then our firewall shutoffs, which shut our fuel off for each engine.
While our camera operator gives us a visual tour of the PBY, let's review some history and statistics. After establishing the United States Airmail Service, Reuben Fleet used the resulting profits and fame to gain control of the Consolidated Aircraft Company. He moved Consolidated from Buffalo, New York, to San Diego to escape the frigid winters.
The wingspan of this aircraft is 104 feet from wingtip to wingtip.
The first order for PBYs was for 200 planes for the United States Navy. They were powered by two 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines. They were secured to the wing with just 4 bolts each. The warm, dry Southern California climate allowed the aircraft to be assembled outdoors and saved thousands of feet of hangar space. Instead of putting the plane in water to check for leaks, the fuselage was pumped full of water. The PBY's three greatest assets were its 4,000-mile range, the ability to fly with one engine off, and its ruggedness. Something I want to emphasize is that the Catalina PBY was built right here in San Diego.
That's correct. There was a number of different models of PBYs. This particular aircraft you see in the background is a PBY 6A, model number 6, and the A standing for Amphibian. And the first prototypes were built in 1933.
And the airplane was considered to be obsolete before World War II.
Yeah, that is correct. So the historians say, but as we know, the aircraft proved to be a very valuable asset during the war for the United States.
And it was built here in San Diego by Consolidated. Now, tell us a little bit about the Confederate Air Force.
The Confederate Air Force, which owns this PBY, is a nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Midland, Texas. We're all volunteers, and we have a number of different wings throughout the world, and many right here in the United States. This aircraft is based in St. Paul, Minnesota. Our mission is to restore and fly World War II aircraft and preserve them and bring them out to show the general public some of the great aircraft that flew over 50 years ago.
Which is better than playing video games.
In my book, that's right.
Pat Anderson and the Catalina PBY, built by Consolidated right here in San Diego. As the pilot prepares to taxi out and take off in this Catalina PBY, we're going to relocate our camera on the roof of the control tower, and we'll be joined by Stan Mahoney, who flew in PBYs back in the 1930s and into the 1940s. In addition to the PBY, he flew the PB2Y, the big brother, and he was the first Navy flight engineer on the B-24. Stan, when did you first start flying in PBYs?
1939, here in San Diego at North Island.
And how long did you fly in them?
Well, at first I flew in two squadrons, VP-11 and VP-14, and I stayed in 14 until 1941. Then I went over to the Convair Test and Acceptance to test PBYs and B-24s and PB2Y3s, but flew with the PBYs until 1943. Then I went to the big boats, that what they call the big brother to the PBY, which is the 4-engine seaplane.
You must have a lot of interesting stories about the PBYs.
But PBY itself is the one that has the interesting stories. It's done a lot.
Can you tell us some of them?
Well, yes, I certainly can. I'll tell you one that's, I'll try to tell it quickly. That is a PBY. We were delivering PBYs from San Diego to Pensacola, Florida. And we got into a storm over by El Paso, Texas. One of the PBYs that were ahead of us tried to go over the storm and ran into terrible clouds at 20,000 feet. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out, and 5 members did. The pilot and the co-pilot come down through the storm, and they saw a big lake in Texas. So they landed the PBY in this big lake, but it turned out to be a mud puddle, only 6 inches deep. The rest of the crew that bailed out, they came back here to San Diego, but they crashed on their way back. As for us, we were in the other PBY, and we flew across the state of Texas at 100-foot altitude and landed at Corpus Christi. The old PBY in the mud puddle, meanwhile, they tied a rope on it and wiggled the tail and the pilot and the co-pilot took off and flew down to Corpus Christi and joined us. That's one story.
Weren't the PBYs sub chasers or sub hunters?
They were the most wonderful of the patrol planes in the first part of the war. They patrolled off of England, and of course they spotted the Bismarck and followed it along until the English battleships come along and sunk it. Also, the PBYs were involved in a lot of patrol off of Pearl Harbor. As a matter of fact, the co-pilot and our crew, Ensign Tanner and Ensign Clark, who was aboard the plane that landed down in Texas, the two of them were out that morning on December the 7th, and Tanner spotted this Japanese submarine off of Pearl Harbor at 7 o'clock in the morning, 1 hour before the attack.
That was a little two-man submarine?
Well, I'm not really sure. I think it was a two-man. I'm not positive. But the USS Ward also spotted the same submarine, and both the Ward and the Tanner and the PBY radioed in that they had spotted this submarine, and they dropped their bombs. That is, the PBY dropped the bombs, and the Ward fired shots and sunk the submarine. That was 1 hour before the attack.
So that was the first offense by the United States in World War II.
Yes, it was. The history credits the Ward as firing the first shot, but as far as aircraft is concerned, the PBY was the one that dropped the first bomb, and that was in Santana.
Now, this plane is on land, so they're not using the floats. Tell us about those floats.
Oh, the floats is the most interesting thing. They are retracted in this picture, and when they wish to deploy them to land on the water, of course you don't need the floats when you're landing on land, but when you go to drop them, when you go into land in the water, they have a torque tube at the trailing edge of the wing, 45 feet long on each wing. Imagine, 45-foot long tube that drives a screw jack on the end of the wing to lower the floats or raise them by an electric motor.
Just like fixing a flat tire, you jack up your car and jack it down.
That's the way it works. You could crank it down too if the motor didn't work right. You know, if your motor failed, well, you could crank it down.
What are some other interesting features about the PBY?
Well, I guess the fact that the first flight I made on Honolulu took 20 hours and about 20 hours, 0.6 to fly from here to Kaneohe. That's quite a ways.
2,000 miles, 100 miles an hour?
2,100 miles, And it had a fuel capacity of around 800 gallons in each wing tank, plus a little bit in a hull tank that we had in the hull. But it was a great airplane.
It was a 20-hour flight?
Oh yeah, it took 20 hours, 20.6. As a matter of fact, the first PBY that flew to Hawaii, there was a group of them. They took almost 24 hours, and when they got there, they're all running out of gas just out of Honolulu, out of Pearl Harbor.
Were a lot of them at Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes, there's an air station at Ford Island on Pearl Harbor, but the big air station, as far as PBYs is concerned, was over at Kaneohe, which is on the other side of the island from Pearl Harbor on Honolulu.
Now, the PBY was built here in San Diego by Consolidated.
Absolutely. See, after I went out of those two squadrons and we went over to Convair, it was Consolidated then. They were building PBYs and B-24s and PB-2Y3s. And it was very impressive to see a line of PBYs a city block long, just maybe 25 or 30 in a line. We would test one and then go back and get another one. We turned out about 5 PBYs a day.
5 a day?
That's right.
Well, it's impressive just to see one here on the runway.
Yeah, they were great to taxi around. You could taxi them real easily, and I remember I was one of the few that was authorized to taxi a PBY, and we used to taxi him down across Harbor Drive and wave to people in an automobile as we crossed the highway.
You had the right of way. Stan, the bubbles on the side of this airplane are very unique.
Well, that's that came out with a PBY 4 actually. The early models had a sliding door, which was very, very. The sliding door was not nearly as good as the bubble because it had. You couldn't hardly get the gun out over the top of the sliding door. Then along came the bubble, as you call it, and it provided a real good platform to operate the two 50 caliber machine guns. There were two gunners at that location, and they had very good opportunity to fire, except they had to watch out they didn't shoot their tail.
I think he's about ready to take off. Let's just sit quietly and let our viewers watch this takeoff.
Fine.
As flight engineer, where were you located and what were your duties?
This is another unusual location for a flight engineer. It was at the center section of the wing, just below the wing, and you could not see forward. All of the instruments were in front of you, and the only way you could see out of the airplane was to look out a little window on each side of you. And the instrument panel, you had the usual engine instruments, plus you controlled the mixture controls and the flaps, the floats, and raising and lowering the floats, and the fuel transfer and all of the regular instruments. Very unusual place for a flight engineer.
What are they cruising at now?
Well, as I recall, we flew along about 100 to 110 miles an hour.
And how much gas an hour?
I think we burned about 35 gallons of gas an hour, which would, in a flight to Hawaii, we didn't have very much left. Oh, what have we got there?
Well, he's going to make a low pass now on his way up to Los Angeles. Is there any final parting comments?
Well, I just think the PBY is a wonderful airplane. You might want to remember that the PBY is the one that located and sighted the Japanese fleet before it bombed Midway. And it circled that fleet for a long, long time until finally they spotted that PBY up there, who had been radioing back to Midway and telling the fleet where they were.
Here he comes for a low pass.
Floats coming up. Sounds just like a PBY.
Looks beautiful in the sky. It would be appropriate at this time to say aloha to the PBY.
Well, that's a good term. Aloha.
And thank you very much, Stan. We appreciated having you with us today.
You're welcome.
The PBY is Stan Mahoney's favorite airplane. If you have a favorite airplane, or a favorite airport, or a favorite aviation activity or organization, let us know. We'd like to do a program for you. We've covered everything from hot air balloons to skydiving to hang gliders. We want to show what you want to see. In order for us to show what you want to see, you have to write and tell us. please do that. Before we close today's program, we have something special for you to see. Let's take a look. Folks, this is Stan Mahoney, who helped narrate part of today's program. We certainly appreciate his help. It made the program better. Stan, we want to give you a souvenir of today's program, an Aviation Theater cap, a gift from Flight Suits Limited and their leather jacket factory outlet, our aviation neighbors right across the street from Gillespie Airport.
Oh, thank you very much. First time I've ever had my own scrambled eggs.
Stan Mahoney.
Thank you.